This is our final week at looking at ancient Israel's constitutional law as well as the constitutional government. And I hope that this series has really enlightened how you think of a theocracy. I hope it's taken it out of the realm of imagination and of generalities of what a restored kingdom of Israel will look like, and out of the realm of something that is abstract that people can say, oh, well, we hope for the day, or we hope for this future restoration, rather than it being a generalized hope, perhaps even a vain hope. Hopefully it's something tangible now that you can qualify. So tonight we are going to be looking at the court, and then next week we're going to bring it all together and look at what it means, not just from a physical standpoint as far as the Constitution and the nation of Israel is concerned, but we're also going to be looking at what that meant theologically. So we're going to kind of tie it all in together next week. So I keep saying it's my favorite portion and my favorite part. And I think when you love the material so much, it's hard to distinguish one part that's greater than the other. So this week we are looking, of course, at the court system. Now, anciently, courts did not distinguish between criminal and civil matters. If there was a case whereby you sinned against your brother, you were also understood to have sinned against God. So if you defrauded someone, if you cheated someone, or if there were, but then you do have other cases where there are just simple controversies where the court would decide and render a verdict. So not all of those cases were considered sins against God, but if you violated a particular statute, such as stealing or murder, those were considered crimes not just against your brother, but also against God. You find that in Torah, what it establishes are constitutional principles. And this really differs from modern law and from the modern U.S. Constitution. And it's something that I think if we had, I think we would have a whole lot more harmony among Americans. We wouldn't deviate from the law as much as what we do. Okay, we are on page 274, and we are going to be going through a page, let me give you this, 281 tonight. So basically about 280. So the judicial court had very specific qualifications to be a judge. In Deuteronomy 1:13, God gives qualifications for a judge. You find that he must be wise, he must be understanding, and he must be known among his tribe. In other words, he has to have a reputation of wisdom among those that know him. You find that, and this is very fascinating because we often think of everything in Torah being given to us directly by the hand of God, and that isn't exactly what we find. We find that that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, in fact, gave Moses very wise counsel and very wise instruction. He told Moses, he says, there is no way you can judge every case. There is no way that you can hear every issue that this incredibly large congregation has. So Jethro advised Moses, he said, set up leaders, set up districts, lower courts and upper courts. And then the cases that are too difficult for them, bring those to you. Save only the most difficult cases for you. Later on, we find that Yahweh actually directly confirms that, that counsel. So then the question that I've had among some people, some of them are skeptics, others are just people, I think, who may be a little bit more conservative, or I don't know, just kind of think within that little box that everything has to come directly from God himself. they say, well, how is it that Jethro could establish this precedent that is incorporated into Israel's legal code? Well, I think we forget Jethro's lineage, which is very important because Jethro himself was a descendant of Abraham. After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife. Her name was Keturah. And he had sons by this woman, and he sent them away from Isaac's possession to the east. And one of those descendants is a man named Midian. And it is from Midian that Jethro's lineage ties. And we find that Jethro was a high priest in Midian, and he had counsel. So he was instructed in the way of YHWH. He understood it. So he was in the perfect place to counsel Moses as far as how this should be applied. The other thing, and I just wanted to touch on this because this is for people that are really struggling and really questioning whether or not Torah is true. One of the criticisms that is levied is that Torah cannot differentiate who Jethro is. Sometimes he's called Jethro, sometimes he's called Raul, and then another place they think he's even called Habab. So who is Jethro? So we have to really start, and in the Hebrew there is Yethro. I am using the English there. But the Hebrew word Yethro means high and exalted one. So really that would have been his Midian title as high priest, where in Israel we find it's Kohanim. In Midian it would have been Yethro. His real name, however, was Raul. So he had both a name and a title. Now, the whole controversy with Habab is really misplaced simply because that was a descendant of Yethro, of Raul, years down the line once you have the situation with Deborah and the conquest that occurred during her administration. But Habab was separated from Jethro by a good 200-year span, and they had no connection. It was just simply that he was a descendant because not all of Jethro's children returned with him to Midian when Jethro separated from the children of Israel. So what you have Jethro and his clan coming out to meet Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness. They live with them. They spend a great deal of time. Remember, Moses had spent many years with Jethro's clan, and he was kind of absorbed as part of the family. So when they are delivered from Israel, they come, they stay with them for a period of time, but eventually Jethro says, it's time for us to part. I'm going to go back to my family, back to my territory, which he does separate. But then you find that part of the clan does indeed stay with Moses, and they are given land within the land of Israel. But you find that they are still recognized as a separate people within the children of Israel. And we'll see that more when we get into chapter 9 and some of the chronology. But I just wanted to lay that down now because we are discussing Jethro. And that way you have an idea as to who he is and his function. So that way if anyone ever says, well, you know, the Bible doesn't even know who he is, there's so many contradictions, they are not contradictions. It is the fact that we are not understanding the titles that are used simply because we're so far removed from the language. And even the word Yethro wouldn't even have been a Hebrew word. It would have been arisen from Midian, which was very likely a language that was very similar to Hebrew, but it would have had different terminology. So we find that Yethro instructs Moses on how to establish a court system and how to establish leaders to delegate the responsibilities of leading the people and of solving their disputes. We also find in this portion, we find the concept that justice is blind. In fact, God specifically commands the judges, and this is still working from Deuteronomy 1 through 13. He specifically says that these judges should be no respecter of persons. This is the idea that justice is blind. It does not matter if you're wealthy. It does not matter if you're poor. It does not matter if you're a person of high social standing or a person of no social standing, or even a person that is frowned upon in society. When you come into court, when you come before the law, you are all one. You are on equal grounding before the court. And what's very fascinating, and this is going to be, I don't have it marked, but it's going to be probably right around verse 9 or 10. I'm sorry, verse, probably about verse 15 of Deuteronomy 1. God specifically states that these judges are not supposed to just judge among Israelites, but also among the stranger that is within Israel's territory or within Israel's tribes. Remember, at this point in time, Deuteronomy is given right before they enter the land. So strangers are also supposed to be able to seek justice, equal justice within Israel's courts. And Israel's courts are not supposed to take into consideration that the person is not a native Israelite. When they come before the bench, their case stands on its own merits. Whether it's accusations or whether it's defense, it is supposed to stand on the merits of the case. You also find this idea, I've got to get some water here, that the judge stands in the place of Yahweh. And the judge is acting as God's agent. And I derived this from the verse right around verse 16 or 17 of Deuteronomy 1, where it says, "Do not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is Yahweh's. If the case be too hard to you, bring it to me." But you find that if it is a case whereby the parameters fall within the different statutes and judgments that are predefined within the law, the judge should be able to make a judgment in that case. So if it falls within those parameters, there's no extenuating circumstances, the judge is supposed to follow those written guidelines and issue a verdict. So he acts in God's behalf. He stands as God's agent on earth, administering justice. So what happens if a judge misrepresents God? The idea is that if you misrepresent God in your cases, if you are not going to execute righteousness and just judgment, then you're going to be fired. And biblically speaking, being fired is not exactly the way you want to go, because it really it entails perhaps even not just a loss of position, but also perhaps a loss of life, because you have defamed God's name by taking bribes, by perverting justice and judgment in Israel. And that is something that God really takes very seriously, because you are carrying his name in that judgment. And to pervert the judgment, especially of the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, anything such as that, is considered a grave perversion according to the law. So we find that whether the person is small or great, he stands equally before the law. We also find that the person is not supposed to fear the people involved, whether it's the king that is involved, whether it is a lay citizen, they are not to fear or respect the person. Now, you also find the idea that if the judgment does have extenuating circumstances. For instance, a great example of this that we looked at over the last couple of weeks is Zelphod's daughters, where they have an actual constitutional issue that revolves around, or that regards the woman's right to inherit when there are no male heirs. And this is a constitutional, this is foundational inheritance and succession issues that is appealed directly to Moses, directly to a constitutional level in front of the tabernacle. And you find that it is something whereby is judged in front of the Adah, the representative congregation, as well as the Levites and Moses as leader of the people. The other thing that's very interesting, when you look not just at this section on the court system, but when you look at the overall constitutional law that we've looked at now in chapters 5, 6, and 7, whether we look at dietary or we look at God's stance on medical care or we look at inheritance or morality, in every case, we find that God's theocracy establishes boundaries, guidelines, principles for living. We do not find that God is involved in every decision that man makes. In fact, we almost find that he has a very hands-off approach to allowing us to live our lives to the fullest, allowing us to reap what we sow, and to giving us the instruction whereby we may prosper. So this is a little bit different than some traditional ideas that we find where, you know, sometimes we expect God to be involved in every aspect of our lives, because we really just don't see that. We do find that he has established a self-representative government, and that self-representative government is always based, is always founded on his constitutional law. He's taught us a way to live. It's just our duty to follow it. So we find that the judges, coming back now to the judges within Israel's society, we find that Moses sets up the leaders of the tribes, the people that are well known, the people that are respected. He initially establishes those to rule over the people. And if you'll remember last week when we looked at it, there was some question as to whether or not this was limited to 70 elders within Israel's congregation, because that is a common tradition. But we saw that when some of the leaders, some of the Adah, rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and they followed Abram and Dathan, that there was 258 of them. So this was a very large body, representative body. It was not limited, because that 258, those 258 members were only part of the overall congregation. So we find that your tribes, your clans, had their own representatives. They judged in their own matters, and they say, like a family court, they judged there. But if there was a discrepancy, if there was some question as to impartiality, if there was some question as to the correctness of the verdict, you always had a separate court that you would appeal to. And that separate court would be the Levites. They were your appellate court, your federal court, whereby they would judge in the matter, and their word was the final verdict. You also find in court cases, very similar to today, that it wasn't just the testimony of a person that was admissible in that trial. You find that evidence was something that the Torah recognizes. I mean, here we are, you know, some 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, and we have God giving Moses a precedent, establishing a rule for court and how cases should be tried that mirrors what we have only recently come to understand in the past couple hundred years. So it's kind of as though we are returning to the center, this original enlightenment that the children of Israel had. So I'm going to just read from this. This is on page 275. And this is, I believe this is a quote from, let me look at his name. He's on my bookshelf over here, from Mr. Wells, who is, he studies biblical law. So this is what he says. He says, objects could also serve as physical evidence in court. According to Exodus 22:12, a herdsman who loses an animal to the predators of wild beasts is not liable to the owner for its replacement. The law requires, however, that the herdsman bring as evidence the remnants of the carcass, which the text actually calls a witness. So scripture recognizes evidence as a witness. So when it says that a person shall not be put to death at the mouth of one or two witnesses, DNA, other forensic type of evidence would be considered a witness in a court trial. And if that overall, if you had 2 or 3 different scientific studies on totally separate aspects of a case, and they were all conclusive, pointing to the guilt of one person, each of those would be considered evidence. So those evidence could possibly influence a guilty or perhaps even capital punishment in those cases if it is conclusive. You also find that cases in ancient times were usually very public displays. You know, we think today, I mean, our court system is just stacked with cases. If you've ever had a traffic ticket, you know that a lot of times it's a few months before you go in. I did indeed receive a ticket a number of years ago. And when I went into court, I was one, I mean, I'm in a really teeny tiny town, but I was one of probably about 80 people that day in court. You know, some people were there on drug charges, some people were there on traffic charges. You really had the whole gamut, but it was a stacked day where, and I think we sat there for something like 10 hours. I mean, it was just incredible. So we think of that as a modern context, but you find anciently, and then coming back to how it would have been, you know, a couple thousand years ago, court cases were the exception. It wasn't as though people were suing each other every day. It wasn't as though there were criminal cases every day. Really, those situations were the exception to daily life and not the day-to-day occurrence. It was something that was not germane to the normal lifestyle. You also find that, and let's go back to Deuteronomy 17 verse 9 is where we're going to look now. And this comes back to the command to establish judges within Israel's land. And God tells Moses, he says, judges and officers shall you make in all your gates, which Yahweh your God gives you, throughout all your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. And you shall come to the priests of the Levites and to the judges in those days and inquire, and they shall show you the sentence of judgment. Do according to the sentence. So the concept here is that first, Israel's first line of appeal, Israel's first line of reconciliation is to the local judges and officers within Israel's local administration, within their clans and tribes. And then if it cannot be solved there, if some sort of resolution cannot be met, then it is appealed to the judges either in Jerusalem or at some other administrative system or rather establishment. But you find there's this command, if you continue on, it says, the sentence they shall teach you and the law which they shall teach you, follow it. Follow the judgment they shall tell you and do not decline from it. You find that the Adah, the Congress which we looked at a couple weeks ago, remember, they were a militia within Israel's community. It was their job to uphold the verdict of a judge, whether he be a clansman or whether he be a Levite. His job was to uphold and enforce that judgment so that Israel had a stable society and so that there was law and order that prevailed throughout the community. Prior to this, the means of establishing disputes, or rather of resolving dispute, was really family between family. So you find that if you lose a son or daughter, maybe another man's camel gets away, he runs away, and maybe your son is standing in the way and he gets trampled by this camel. Perhaps there's a death that is involved. Who's liable? If the court finds that the camel owner is not negligent, if it was just an accident and he is absolved of the charges, that family has to respect that, even though it's very difficult. But by the same token, before the court was established, in prior times, you really would have had sometimes these family wars where one family would go out and seek retribution for their son's death, and they would fight and argue among themselves, and what you would end up would be the death of many family members, as one family would war against the other family and they would seek to almost annihilate each other. You know, one family protecting itself and the other one seeking compensation of some sort for their loss. So you also find that this idea of law, that is a very Western concept. You know, it's something that we find in Greek and Roman society, but it's fascinating. And I like to point this fact out to people, is that the Roman Republic, and that the ideas of some sort of democracy within the Roman Republic, you don't find those ideas being tossed around and being established until after Israel's diaspora. So Israel would have been dispersed around 587. You would have had a lot of people, you know, as Assyria attacked Israel, it comes 700 BCE, and then Babylon becomes on the scene and is a threat. A lot of people would have seen the handwriting on the wall, and many of those people would have immigrated to other nations before the country fell to Babylon. Not that it was a large percentage of the population, but at least a small percentage would have gone into other territories. And as a matter of fact, we find that God states that his purpose in some of the trials was to scatter Israel. You find that in Deuteronomy. So Israel scatters to other lands, and what do they take with them? They take with them this knowledge of constitutional ideas of justice and judgment. And all of a sudden you find, whether it is with Taoism in China, or whether it is with the Roman Republic in Greece, you find a lot of ideas that really stem from this Torah understanding. And then eventually the Greeks, and then later the Romans, become strong enough where they actually implement it, and they establish self-determination within their government. Now, Israel, of course, was very different than that, because for the Roman Republic, a lot of it was hodgepodge. Their laws were man-made, where with ancient Israel, you did have a divinely revealed law that established a constitutional ideal for the entire nation, and it brought unity for the entire nation to follow it and to respect it. You also find that, you know, and I love showing the parallels between our modern system of government and ancient Israel's government. One of the rights, one of the privileges that the king of Israel had was his ability to grant pardons. Today, both presidents and governors have the right to grant pardons to their constituents. So, you know, a lot of times you'll see the president, he may write 100 pardons on one day of the year, and governors kind of do the same thing. You find that in ancient Israel, they did the exact same thing. And there's one case that we have in particular of a mother, and let me find this because I'm kind of jumping outside of my notes here. You find there was this mother where her son had killed his brother. So you didn't have the issue of another family being involved. You didn't have the issue of another family needing that closure and that retribution. But a son had killed his brother. And the woman comes before David because her son, her surviving son, I believe it was her eldest son, I don't quite remember, but I think it was the court's judgment that he should be put to death because he indeed committed murder. And like modern law and modern ideas of justice, it is though justice calls out, as though there is the weights and balances need to be equal. So the idea that justice is blind and that it calls for justice if a crime has been committed, no matter who you are, no respecter of persons. This mother's son was set to be put to death. So the mother comes before David. She asks for a pardon. She asks that David will exonerate her son. And David hears her request and he grants it. But he does not grant it before having the mother take a self-imprecating oath, taking a curse that her son that it will now survive, that's being pardoned, will bear his sin, and their children will bear the sin. And what this means is that in the day that those children and those descendants depart from the way of Yahweh, in the day that they no longer follow the Constitution, the judgment will be swift. Their houses would be the first to go into captivity or the first to be slaughtered. They're going to be the first to face any sort of destruction that comes on the land because they bear that curse. Now, if they live righteously, if they do not depart from the law, if they return to their God-given foundation, then that curse escapes them and there is no culpability. But David does this. David's whole purpose in doing this was to make sure that any error in judgment, any error in that pardon lies squarely on the woman and her children, and that David and his household are exonerated from the consequences of granting mercy in a case where mercy is not normally called for. So I think, when we see these things in context, when we see these things that they did in ancient times, can you imagine if our judges did something similar to this today? How differently our judges would try cases, the incredible responsibility that that judge bears, that he and his family can bear for making a biased decision. It's not just, one case goes and another one comes, and it's just, work that you do through the day, working through your docket. These are lives. These are people that matter, and it's something that you're supposed to be very sober about and take generational consequences into consideration. So I'm going to come back, because I did kind of skip around a little bit, to the idea of constitutionally defined tort. And this is something where modern tort in America, I believe, is truly lacking. And let me give you some examples. Today, whether you are on the constitutional side or you're on the judiciary side, as far as writing the Constitution at the congressional level, or on the judiciary side, seeing how it should be applied, there is this idea that the United States Constitution is a living constitution. Now, that means different things to different people. For some people, that means that because it's living, it can evolve, it can become progressive, it can shed some of its traditional ideas that may have held it back, and maybe it didn't fully embrace social justice, and the Constitution is allowed to evolve over time. The other idea of a living Constitution is that the statutes, the laws, the ideas that it presents are absolute. They do not change. However, the way it is applied can be adapted to new situations and to new experiences as those arise. And it is this latter view that Torah embraces. But where it really supersedes the United States Constitution is that it gives us precedence within the law. So in the United States Constitution, we don't have anything written that says, when a case comes before you and you have this set of circumstances, this is how you should decide this case. Or it doesn't even give us different scenarios. Rather, in the United States, our decisions are based on court precedent. So if a federal court has decided one way, and you 5 years down the road have a somewhat similar case, you can defer and you can appeal to that prior case when you are making your arguments before a judge. And these prior cases, especially if they're Supreme Court decisions, will help bolster your case, and those precedents will be allowed to help establish your rights under the law. So it's very evolving. And in one of these, let me just give you an example with the 14th Amendment. In I believe it was in the 1980s, there was a case that came before the Supreme Court regarding what constitutes a natural born citizen. And there was a footnote given in the brief by Justice Brennan, where he said any child that is born in the United States is a United States citizen. And now we have this, what is called the anchor baby issue or controversy within Israel society because of a footnote. It's not even part of the original brief, but it's a footnote in the brief that opens up a whole new definition of law within America. So you did not have that in ancient Israel because everything was defined at the constitutional level. So what God did in his wisdom is he gave you a sampling of about 5 or 6 different cases within the Torah. And he says, if this type of case comes before you, this is how you should judge. So by setting those precepts, those principles at a constitutional level, you are always to appeal to that precedent. It does not exclude that you can't use another case as an example for how another court ruled in a similar situation, but it will never carry the weight and it will never establish any sort of law writing. I mean, the judiciary is not supposed to write law anyway, but it really closes that gap by limiting what the court can do, because the court can only apply what is written constitutionally. It really can't evolve and establish new opinions that then really function as law. So that's a lot of wisdom, I believe, in the Torah. The other thing that we find in Torah that differs from the United States Constitution deals with the freedom of speech. Now, this is very controversial because, you know, what is it that we really appreciate in America? We appreciate our religious liberty. We appreciate our freedom of speech. And down here in the South, it's definitely your right to bear arms. Those are like, you know, your 3, what is it, God, guns, and the Bible, something like that. So in Scripture, you find that there are 2 injunctions on speech. The first one has to do with what you said regarding the law. And let's look at this. Let me look at my notes here real quick. You find that the prohibition on free speech where the Torah is concerned. And if you'll turn with me to Deuteronomy 27, verse 26, it states, "Cursed be he that confirms not all the words of this law to do them, and all the people shall say amen." Now, I want you to read this very carefully, because notice what this text does not say. It does not say, "Cursed be he that does not do all the words of this law." That's not what this text is saying. "Cursed be he that does not confirm or uphold that all the words of these law should be done." That is the context. And especially if you go back to the Hebrew in that verse and you look at the Hebrew, it conveys this idea that you're cursed if you do not support, if you do not uphold the fact that the Constitution is relevant, if you do not uphold the fact that the Constitution is applicable to your generation, to your people, and your society. So the one thing that one of the limits on free speech was you could never come to a rally or a political convention or go to your Klansmen or to your Levites or whatever it is and claim that the Torah is outdated, claim that the Torah did not apply to you, that it had outlived its usefulness, or claim that, you know, it was good for, you know, my ancestors maybe 1,000 years ago, but it really doesn't apply to me. That was something that was banned in Torah. But the question is why? You find that what the Torah did, it established a limited government, a government that that defined liberty. It protected liberty. It protected enormous freedoms and established accountability for when people violated it, regardless of your race, your age, your gender, regardless of who you were. Torah established righteousness, justice, and which affected harmony and peace on the land. The entire point of Torah was to bring Israel out of the house of bondage. And that is exactly what it did. And we can see those blessings within our more modern United States Constitution, and how America has enjoyed more liberty and freedom than any other nation of the earth. People are not wanting to immigrate to Afghanistan or immigrate to Russia. Maybe if you're Eric Snowden, you are, but on a general basis, you're not wanting to flee to Russia to have liberty. And even within Europe, there's some constraints on that liberty and that freedom. For instance, homeschooling. You cannot homeschool throughout most of Europe. You cannot homeschool in much of the Mideast because it is very, if you have that ability, then it is usually within a state-functioned educational system. But you find Israel's Constitution established enormous freedom. It defined human rights, and it protected those human rights. And to come at the Torah and to claim that it was no longer relevant was a ploy to enslave people. It was a ploy to take advantage of an uneducated populace that was not well educated. So that is why you see God giving the Levites the instruction and the responsibility of educating the citizens every Shabbat in the Torah. Because if they're so well grounded in the principles, so well grounded in the precepts, they're not going to be led astray by voices that claim that it's outdated or claim that it's no longer relevant. So that is just very important. The other thing that we find in Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 12:32, and it differs a little bit if you're going by the JPS. I believe it's 13:1 in the JPS. But the command there, and we often look at this, I know a lot of us do, in kind of a Karaite context, where it says, you shall not add to the word I give you this day, you shall not diminish from it. And we look at that as not adding to the law, not taking away from it. You know, speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible is silent. And I think that is a very valid interpretation. But if you look at it one step further, if you look at this constitutionally, what God is disallowing, what he is forbidding, are constitutional amendments. So never can the Adah or the judiciary or the king, no branch of government in Israel's society can ever add an amendment to ancient Israel's constitution. And the reason for this, if you look at what David says in Psalms 19, especially around verse 7, God and King David both view the Torah as perfect, as capable of healing, as establishing liberty. It was not something that needed to be amended. But because it is a living constitution, its precepts, its principles can always be applied to new situations. You don't have to go back and rewrite it to apply it to new situations, because the principles and precepts are universal. There's no time limit on those. For instance, let me just give you an example. One of the stipulations in Torah is that if you live in a city, you are to put a fence around your roof. Now, the reason you did this anciently is because the city streets would be crowded, and you would often walk from roof to roof throughout the city. So when people walked over your roof, you wanted to have some sort of barrier so that they didn't fall. So you were protecting your fellow citizen. It was a matter of negligence. Today, we do not walk on roofs, but the principle still is the same. If you build a building, if you have a balcony, put a fence around it, protect people. I don't think any of us today would have a 2-story balcony where we did not put some sort of railing or banister, guardrail to protect people so that they didn't accidentally fall off. Common sense. So those can be applied in the context of a living constitution. There is no reason to rewrite it, because the principles are universal and the values are universal. So we find that the Constitution, or rather in ancient Israel, there was no rigid precedent within Israel's tribal or Levitical court systems. While those ideas and those judgments could be referred to or deferred to, they did not establish a strict tort where the law was concerned. Rather, Israel's prosecutors or the defense team would always appeal primarily to the Constitution, and that would be the basis for Israel's governance. You also find in Israel's history, you find these periods where Israel declines from the law. And after David and Solomon's death, we have Rehoboam, and we have a period from Rehoboam through Asaph where Israel really does decline from the law. They're no longer following a government function, and we find that government actually kind of falls apart. We find that Jehoshaphat, if you look at 2 Chronicles 17:2, and again in verse 7 through 9, we find that Jehoshaphat once again reestablishes judges in all the land. And because of the corruption that had been in the land, he requires these judges to answer directly to him. So there's some sort of administration change that occurs under Jehoshaphat's authority, whereby he is going to make sure that, you know, bribes and corruption does not enter into this court system that he is reestablishing on Israel's land. The other thing that we find, of course, is that the Adah is always there to reinforce judgments. But then when the court cannot reach a verdict, when the court is torn, maybe there's a split decision, or maybe there are mitigating circumstances that they really don't know how to solve, they are always to bring that to the place where Yahweh has placed his name. And that means coming to Jerusalem and seeking, not just anywhere, but seeking to the high priest and seeking to the Ark of the Covenant. And it always talks about seeking Yahweh between the cherubim. If you read in the Psalms, and then Moses also refers to this, Yahweh says, I will be sought between the cherubim. And if you've ever wondered what this means, I'd like to share with you something that may enlighten how you understand the Ark of the Covenant, what it meant, and why it was important in Israel's history. So if you look at Psalms, this is going to be, hold on, let me get to the right page here. Okay, if you look at Psalms 99, you find that David has left us a treasure trove of information. In Psalms 99, David uses topic sentences, where he'll give a topic sentence and then he will describe what that sentence is about. Kind of very, not exactly poetic, but just very, not exactly a song and chorus, but something along those lines. You find that David has given us a definition for why these cherubim are so important, and he's also told us what they represent in Israel's history. So in Psalms 99, the first verse, or at least verse 2, it says, Yahweh is great in Zion, he is high above the people. Verse 3 says, let them praise your great and terrible name. And then this is the key when we get to verses 4 and 5. It says, the king's strength also loves judgment. You do establish equity, you execute judgment and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt you, Yahweh, our God, and worship at his footstool, for he is holy. Now here's the key in verses 6 and 7. Moses and Aaron among his priests, Samuel among them that call upon his name. They call on Yahweh, and he answered them. He spoke to them in the cloudy pillar. They kept his testimonies and the ordinance that he gave to them. But notice the introduction to this part of the psalm. The topic sentence here states that Yahweh sits between the cherubim. So who do these cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant represent? Well, David proceeds to tell us in verses 5 through 7 that it represents the king and the priest. So between the council of the king and priest, you should find, because remember what's between the king and priest. What sits beneath them? Inside the Ark of the Covenant is Israel's Constitution. The Torah is in the compartment of the Constitution. So when the king and the priest counsel together, and when they are founded on that Constitution, they should find unity. They should find common ground. And if they don't, they should pray, seek to Yahweh. And the idea is that he will guide their judgment, and he will grant understanding as to how to decide in a particular case. So when you hear this idea of seeking Yahweh between the cherubim, remember that it is always founded on that document within the Ark of the Covenant, and it brings solidarity. It brings incredible peace to Israel and their nation. So the last part of the teaching tonight that I'd like to focus on is the second prohibition on the freedom of speech. The first prohibition was speaking against the Constitution being valid for your generation. It did not dissuade the ability to debate how Torah should be applied, to debate how it should relate to a particular situation, or whether one way or another way was the particular way to interpret it, or the particular way to carry it out. That was not what it was at issue. The issue, again, was simply whether or not the Torah was valid for your society and your generation. The second prohibition is found in Exodus 22, verse 28. And this prohibition on free speech states, "You shall not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of your people." And this statute was for two reasons. Number one, you could not revile Yahweh. This is found in the prohibition against cursing the name of Yahweh, using it in vain, that we find in the Ten Commandments. But beyond Yahweh, you don't even revile the gods of other nations, because when you do, it provokes animosity. It provokes a lot of tension between nations, and it damages and scars those relationships. You don't curse the ruler of your people, because he is your leader. Now, this again did not limit criticism. It did not limit, discussing policies or what a leader of your people did. That is not what is issue. A curse, as we saw with David and the mother, where he had the mother of this murderer take a self-imprecating oath. A curse is a negative prophecy that is spoken against a particular person. And that is just something that you don't do. You don't issue a curse against the ruler of your people. It instills social strife. It instills social breakdown. And it is just, there are other ways legally that you can pursue justice and judgment. And we find that Israel indeed did this, or rather at least Judah did. Judah replaced no less than 3 monarchs during the divided monarchy years. They replaced Azariah when he rebelled against Yahweh. They replaced him with Hezekiah, or I'm sorry, they replaced him with Uzziah. And then you find Ahaz is later replaced with Hezekiah. So you find throughout Judah's history, when one monarch rebels against the way of Yahweh, when he becomes oppressive, when he usurps his constitutional authority, taking on more power than what he is constitutionally granted, you find that the Adah, the elders of the people, as well as the Levites, unite to dispose of him, a coup, and then you find that they replace him with another descendant of David that is eligible to rule. Sometimes these are really young children that are put into these positions until they come of age. But what you do not find is the people cursing the leaders and stirring up social strife. It is simply that there are more wiser ways in which to handle evil ruler, a ruler that is oppressive, or a ruler that is maybe, like King Solomon, he has a lot of wives, he's serving other deities. When that occurs, there are just simply other ways to handle it. The way that Israel handled Solomon's sin, for instance, was that when he died, and it came to serving his son, most of the nation, 10 tribes, refused to serve his son, and they followed after Jeroboam. So again, it comes down to finding peaceful ways to resolve those social conflicts. So that is where we're going to end tonight, and that did put us on about 280. Next time we're going to read or go through 281. It's going to be kind of a little bit longer, 281 to 306. And this is where we will bring in the harmony, the overall message and theme of ancient Israel's constitution. And we're going to look at it, shift from looking at it from the governmental, constitutional, and legal side, and we're going to look at it also from a theological side and see how it influences that aspect of Torah. So at this point, I open it up for any questions or comments or anything else that you guys want to add. I look forward to hearing it. This has just been, I really learned from this material. Every time I go through it, I think I pick something new up along the way and just re-solidify, the things that you've already studied. All right, so Betty says, if churches claim Torah is not relevant today, are they bringing curses on themselves? Very good point. So let me ask you this. One of the stipulations in Torah is that we do not eat shrimp, shellfish, and pork. If we say that the law is done away with, if we say that it's no longer relevant, and we go out and we eat shrimp, shellfish, pork, and maybe even you can today maybe include GMOs and different things that may also be an obstacle to good health, you're going to naturally receive the consequences of your ways. And it may not be your generation, but what you find is that health is oftentimes laid up for your children. So they may inherit a more propensity to heart disease, greater risk of cancer. So you simply put those successive generations at greater risk. So yes, it is a curse. If you look at Deuteronomy 28, especially around, I believe it's verse 54, it speaks about diseases of long continuance. So most of these curses within the law are self-perpetuating. They're something that you can do. If you follow the law, you will avoid a lot of these potholes. If you don't sleep around prior to modern blood transfusions and some of the things we're doing medically, if you did not sleep around, you're not going to contract a sexually transmitted disease. A sexually transmitted disease is indeed a curse of the law because you're not following the morality code of Leviticus 18. So, if you state Torah is irrelevant, it's something that you do not recognize the full benefit of. Now, I don't think that modernly we bear the same responsibility to the extent that ancient Israel did, because ancient Israel had it, but I do think America, and let's maybe bring this full circle. I think America bears this responsibility where the United States Constitution is. And every time we have a group of people or we have a political movement that wants to state that the United States Constitution is no longer valid, it's no longer relevant, it's an outdated document written by this group of misogynist, prejudiced men, when we do that, rather than looking at what the document actually says, and rather than being, going down and looking at all these straw men and red herrings, that are non-issues, look at what the document actually says. Look at the liberty actually established in the document and it brings it full circle. It protects your liberty. So if we in the United States today get rid of our right to bear arms, we get rid of our freedom of religion, yes, we're going to bring a curse on ourselves because we've limited those. Now, as far as Torah is concerned, we bring those on individually, but because we do not have the entire Torah at a government level, it doesn't quite carry the same force. I hope I answered your question with that, because there are some things that are directly parallel and then other things which don't exactly correlate one-to-one. Cindy says they have done away with Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. Yes, many churches have. And here's the key, because and that is a claim that is made, is that the curses of the law are done away with. But for me, when I started searching and I started questioning, I can't tell you how many Christians and some Jews, and a lot of people who are atheist, agnostic. It doesn't matter your religion. It doesn't matter your ethnicity. People everywhere, you see them struggling with the curses of the law. They struggle with disease. They struggle with financial hardship. They struggle with the fact that there's not always justice. When they go to a court of law, they're not always getting a just verdict. Sometimes it's perverted by special interest groups. For instance, let me give you guys one. I do publish, I do write books, and one thing that is facing all authors, all publishing companies, is the fact that you now have these huge monopolies that are dictating what you can and cannot do with books. And they're dictating it by allowing certain price setting. So you have monopolies in Amazon, you have monopolies in some more private institutions. And if you don't publish through them, they're just not going to carry your work. They're not going to promote it. It's really not going to go anywhere. Well, in court cases that have been brought against them by publishers and authors over the last 10 years, the court system has sided with your big box companies, whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon, to the detriment of authors. So when you guys see books on Amazon, most of those books may be selling for $18, $20. The actual author, because of Amazon's fee structure, the actual author is only getting about 1 or 2 cents per book. But this is a court case where the court is being persuaded by big groups, by big businesses, and it's hurting everyone else. It's hurting all the small publishers. It's hurting even so many of the big publishing companies. It's hurting them too. And then it's especially hurting the authors. So those type of things, when you decline from a law, when you decline from constitutional precepts and values, everyone in your society suffers, even though that author or that publishing company may not have done themselves anything wrong. It is the fact that you're declining from those constitutional values as a society, and your entire nation suffers. And we see that in a lot of recent Supreme Court decisions, and even in some of the laws that Congress has passed over the last 8 years. So I hope that answers or gives some good headway in that direction. Any other questions or comments? And that was a fantastic question, Betty. So we next week, again, we will finish up this section on the law, and then we're going to jump into who wrote the Bible. We're going to progress into a more historical study of the Bible in its context. And do join in tomorrow morning for Roots of Faith at 10:30. And then Monday morning, you guys will join me at Dove TV at 10:30 a.m. I will be posting a link for that. But if you have any other questions or comments, I look forward to them. And if not, we'll go ahead and call it an evening. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys again back next week. So trying to think if there was anything else. It seemed like there was something else I wanted to mention tonight, but it's not coming to mind. Just not thinking of it right now. So, all right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. I always enjoy spending this time with you all, and I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat, and we will see you back next week. Shabbat Shalom.